Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepless Curiosity. I'm glad you're here tonight, wherever in the world you're settling in from. Here's the strange thought we're sitting with tonight. Somewhere out there, the sky should not be this quiet. There are more planets in this galaxy alone than there are grains of sand on every beach you've ever walked. Trillions of chances spread across billions of years for something to look up the way you're looking up right now. Think about what that actually means. Not a handful of chances, not a lucky roll here and there. Trillions of worlds warmed by trillions of suns, each one a fresh attempt at the same experiment life apparently ran here on Earth. Some of those attempts had a head start of 1 billion years on us. Some of them had all the time in the universe to learn how to build ships, send signals, cross the dark, and yet nothing answers back. No light where there shouldn't be light, no voice in the static, just an old, patient, silent sky. One small favour before we drift into it. While you're getting comfortable, hit subscribe if you're new here, leave a like, comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. It always amazes me how far these quiet little broadcasts travel. So settle in, get cozy, and let's sit with the question that has quietly unsettled physicists for 70 years. If the universe had every reason to be crowded, where is everyone? Let's slowly ease into this. In the summer of 1950, a group of physicists were walking to lunch at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the same desert compound where the atomic bomb had been built only 5 years earlier. They were talking about flying saucers, which had become something of a running joke in the popular press that summer. Somewhere between the office and the cafeteria, the conversation drifted, the way conversations do among people who spend their lives thinking about very large numbers. And then Enrico Fermi, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, a man who had personally overseen the first controlled nuclear chain reaction, stopped walking. He asked a question that his colleagues would remember for the rest of their lives. He simply said, "Where is everybody?" He was not asking about the people at the lab. He was asking about the aliens. And the strange thing is, nobody at that table could give him a good answer. Not because the question was silly, because the question was, when you actually worked through the numbers, disturbingly serious. Here is the shape of what troubled him, and it is worth walking through slowly, because it is the seed that everything else in this story grows out of. The Milky Way galaxy is somewhere around 13 billion years old. Our Sun is a relative latecomer, having formed only about 4.5 billion years ago, which means there have been stars and presumably planets, forming and cooling and settling into stability for billions of years before Earth ever coalesced out of its own cloud of dust. If you assume, even conservatively, that a meaningful fraction of those older star systems developed life, and that some smaller fraction of that life developed intelligence, and that some smaller fraction still developed the kind of technology capable of building ships and sending signals, you are still left with an uncomfortable amount of time. Even a civilization expanding at a pace far slower than anything we might consider science fiction, using ships that crawl along at a tiny fraction of the speed of light, could, in principle, spread across the entire galaxy in something on the order of a few million years. That sounds like an enormous span of time from where you are lying right now. But set it against the age of the galaxy, and it is nothing. It is a rounding error. It is the very last sliver of cosmic history. Which means that if intelligent, technological life is even moderately common, the galaxy should not merely contain some. It should be saturated with it. Every corner of it should show some fingerprint of engineering somewhere by now. Fermi's question was not really about whether aliens exist. It was about the size of the silence that surrounds us if they do. To understand why this bothered a room full of physicists enough that it became one of the most famous open problems in science, you have to sit for a moment with just how large the numbers involved actually are. There are, by current estimates, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 billion to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way alone. And the Milky Way is only one of roughly 2 trillion galaxies inside the observable universe. Multiply those two numbers together, loosely, and you arrive at a number of stars so large that human language starts to strain trying to describe it. More stars than there are grains of sand on every beach and in every desert on this planet, multiplied several times over. For most of human history, we assumed that planets were rare, that stars mostly burned alone, without company, and that a system like ours, with its neat little arrangement of rocky worlds and gas giants circling a stable yellow star, might be some kind of cosmic fluke. That assumption has been completely overturned in the last 3 decades, and we will spend real time on that later tonight, because it changes the entire shape of this problem. For now, it is enough to know that planets, once thought to be scarce, now appear to be the default outcome of star formation. Nearly every star you can see in the night sky likely has at least one world orbiting it, and a significant fraction of those worlds sit in the temperate zone where liquid water, and therefore the chemistry we associate with life, becomes possible. So lay the pieces on the table together. Hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy alone, most of them carrying planets. A meaningful fraction of those planets sitting in the zone where life as we understand it could take hold. Billions of years of head start for many of those systems, since plenty of stars in the galaxy are far older than our sun. And a level of physics, as far as we can tell, that is the same everywhere in the universe. The same carbon, the same water, the same gravity, the same chemistry that produced you should, in principle, be available to produce something like you on a billion other worlds. Fermi's colleagues did the arithmetic that day at Los Alamos in their heads, roughly the way physicists do, and they arrived at the uncomfortable conclusion that the galaxy should be loud. It should be humming with radio traffic, littered with probes, threaded through with the light of Dyson spheres and megastructures built by civilizations old enough to have mastered their own stars. Instead, when we point our instruments at the sky, we get almost nothing. A profound, patient stillness. No unambiguous signal. No structure that couldn't be explained by ordinary astrophysics. No visitors, no wreckage, no whisper. This gap between what the numbers predict and what we actually observe is what has come to be known as the Fermi Paradox. And I want to be precise about what kind of problem this actually is, because it gets mischaracterized constantly in popular science. It is not really a paradox in the strict logical sense, the way a true paradox contains an internal contradiction that cannot be resolved. It is better understood as a tension, a gap between expectation and evidence that demands an explanation. And the honest, sometimes uncomfortable truth is that nobody has one. Not a confirmed one anyway. What we have instead is roughly 7 decades of some of the most brilliant minds in physics, astronomy, biology, and philosophy proposing solutions. Some of those solutions are almost comforting. Some of them, and I want to be honest with you about this now so it doesn't catch you off guard later tonight, are deeply unsettling once you actually sit with their implications. Some suggest that we are essentially alone, the first and perhaps only technological civilization to have ever emerged in this galaxy, carrying an almost unbearable kind of cosmic responsibility. Others suggest something closer to a filter, an obstacle so difficult to pass that almost nothing gets through it, and the darker question that follows is whether humanity has already cleared that obstacle or whether it is still somewhere ahead of us. A few years after that lunchtime conversation, a young radio astronomer named Frank Drake would try to bring some mathematical discipline to Fermi's offhand question. He would build an equation, not to answer the question definitively, because the honest truth is that we still don't have enough data to answer it definitively, but to organize our ignorance into something we could actually reason about, piece by piece. That equation, and the long, strange history of trying to fill in its blanks, is where we're going next. Part 2. The equation built from ignorance. In 1961, Frank Drake was a young astronomer working at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia. A year earlier, he had pointed a radio telescope at two nearby sun-like stars for a project called Project Ozma, quietly listening for any signal that might indicate something intelligent was broadcasting from the other end. Nothing came through. But the attempt itself was significant, because it marked the moment the search for extraterrestrial intelligence stopped being pure speculation and became something you could actually point instruments at. Later that year, Drake organized a small, informal gathering at Green Bank to discuss the scientific search for alien civilizations. In preparation for the meeting, he wrote a single equation on a chalkboard, intended less as a rigorous scientific formula and more as an agenda, a way of breaking an impossibly large question down into smaller, more manageable pieces. That equation would go on to become one of the most famous formulas in the history of science, not because it produces a reliable answer, but because of how honestly it exposes the size of what we don't know. The Drake equation estimates the number of technological civilizations in our galaxy that we might currently be able to communicate with. It does this by multiplying together a chain of factors: the rate at which stars form in the galaxy, the fraction of those stars that have planets, the average number of planets per star that could potentially support life, the fraction of those planets on which life actually develops, the fraction of that life which evolves into intelligence, the fraction of intelligent civilizations that develop technology capable of releasing detectable signals into space. And finally, the length of time such a civilization continues to broadcast those signals before it falls silent, whether through collapse, self-destruction, or simply moving on to communication methods we could never detect. Multiply all of those numbers together, and you are supposed to get an estimate of how many civilizations are out there right now, at this very moment, capable of being heard. Here is the part that Drake himself was completely upfront about from the very beginning. Almost none of those numbers were actually known in 1961. Some of them, frankly, are still not well known today, more than 60 years later. The equation was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be a map of our own uncertainty, a way of seeing exactly where our ignorance lives, term by term, so that future scientists would know precisely which questions needed answering. And that is exactly what has happened, slowly, patiently, over the decades since. The first two terms in the equation, the rate of star formation and the fraction of stars with planets, have gone from being almost complete guesses to being reasonably well constrained by observation. We now know that stars form in the Milky Way at a rate of roughly 1 to a few new stars per year, a number refined through decades of careful astronomical surveying. And the second term, the fraction of stars with planets, has undergone one of the most dramatic revisions in the history of astronomy. For most of the 20th century, this number was essentially a shrug. Nobody had ever directly detected a planet orbiting another star. It was entirely reasonable, given the technology of the time, to wonder whether planetary systems might be rare, some kind of unusual byproduct of very specific formation conditions that our own solar system happened to satisfy. That assumption held until 1995, when Swiss astronomers Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz detected a planet orbiting the star 51 Pegasi, a discovery that would eventually earn them the Nobel Prize in Physics. It was the first confirmed exoplanet orbiting a sun-like star, and it opened a door that has not stopped swinging since. In the years that followed, and especially after the launch of the Kepler Space Telescope in 2009, the picture changed almost completely. Kepler stared at a single patch of sky containing roughly 150,000 stars for years at a time, watching patiently for the tiny periodic dimming that occurs when a planet passes in front of its star from our point of view. What it found, by the time its mission ended, was staggering in its implications. Planets are not rare. They are essentially everywhere. Current estimates suggest that on average, every star in the galaxy hosts at least one planet, and many host several. Multiply that by the hundreds of billions of stars in the Milky Way, and you arrive at a galaxy that likely contains somewhere on the order of 100 billion planets, possibly more. Of those, a meaningful fraction sit within what astronomers call the habitable zone, sometimes referred to more evocatively as the Goldilocks zone. This is the narrow range of orbital distance from a star where a planet's surface temperature allows liquid water to exist stably, not so close that oceans boil away, not so far that they freeze solid. Current estimates suggest that roughly 1 in 5 Sun-like stars hosts an Earth-sized planet within this zone. Applied across the galaxy, that produces a number of potentially habitable worlds somewhere in the range of tens of billions, just within the Milky Way alone. Sit with that for a moment before we move forward, because it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind all at once. Tens of billions of worlds, spread across our galaxy alone, sitting in the zone where liquid water could exist on their surface right now, tonight, while you are lying there listening to this. This is where the equation starts to get genuinely uncomfortable, because the terms that follow, the fraction of habitable planets on which life actually emerges, the fraction of that life which becomes complex, the fraction of complex life which becomes intelligent, and the fraction of intelligent life which becomes technological, are almost completely unconstrained by direct observation. We have exactly one confirmed example of a planet with life on it, this one, and you cannot derive a statistical probability from a sample size of 1, no matter how badly you want to. This is not a small caveat, it is the entire crux of the problem. Optimists who plug generous values into these later terms, arguing that if the chemistry works here, it should work commonly elsewhere, produce Drake equation estimates suggesting there could be thousands, even millions of communicating civilizations in the galaxy right now. Pessimists, arguing that the jump from simple chemistry to self-replicating life, and then again from simple life to complex life, and then again from complex life to intelligence, and then again from intelligence to technology, each represents an enormously improbable step. Produce estimates where the expected number of civilizations in the entire galaxy might be less than 1, meaning us. Only us. Both of these positions are compatible with everything we currently know. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of the Drake equation. It is not a broken tool, it is an honest one. It tells you, with mathematical precision, exactly how little we actually know about the two hardest and most important questions in this entire field. How easily does life begin, and how easily does life become like us? To understand why those two questions are so devastatingly difficult, we need to look at what actually happened here, on this planet, roughly 4 billion years ago, in the earliest chapters of Earth's own story. Because buried inside that history is a series of events so improbable, so contingent, and in some cases so violent, that some scientists have come to believe they represent something far stranger than ordinary chemistry. They may represent a filter. And that filter is where we are going next. Part 3. The filter hiding in deep time. To understand why some scientists believe the emergence of life might be one of the rarest events in the universe, you have to go back much further than the dinosaurs, much further than the first fish, much further than anything with a name you learned in school. You have to go back roughly 4 billion years to a young, violent Earth barely 500 million years old, still glowing from its own formation, still being pummeled by debris left over from the birth of the solar system. This period is sometimes called the Hadean Eon, named after Hades, the underworld, because the conditions on the surface would have been closer to your idea of hell than anything resembling the blue and green planet you know today. The atmosphere was toxic by modern standards, thick with volcanic gases. The oceans, if they had formed yet, were under constant bombardment from asteroids and comets, some large enough to vaporize entire seas on impact. And somewhere in the middle of this chaos, according to the geological and chemical evidence we have been able to piece together, something extraordinary happened. Chemistry became biology. Nobody currently alive knows exactly how this occurred. This is worth saying plainly and without hedging, because it is one of the genuinely open frontiers of science. We understand, in broad strokes, the kind of chemistry that had to happen. Simple molecules, carbon-based, dissolved in water, had to somehow organize themselves into something capable of two very specific things. Storing information in a molecule we now know as something like an ancestor to Runar or Dinar, and using energy from the environment to maintain itself and eventually make copies of itself. The moment those two capabilities came together in a single system, you no longer had chemistry, you had life in the most basic, definable sense. A thing that could persist, replicate, and evolve. The trouble is that scientists working in laboratories today, with the full weight of modern chemistry and nearly a century of accumulated research behind them, have never managed to recreate that transition from scratch. We have gotten remarkably close in certain specific steps. In 1953, a graduate student named Stanley Miller, working with his advisor Harold Urey at the University of Chicago, ran electricity through a sealed flask containing water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, simulating what scientists at the time believed the early Earth's atmosphere and a lightning strike might have looked like. Within a week, the flask contained amino acids, the basic building blocks of proteins, the fundamental components used by every living thing on this planet. It was a genuinely thrilling result, and it suggested that the raw materials of life might assemble themselves fairly easily under the right conditions. But amino acids are not life. They are the alphabet, not the sentence, let alone the story. The gap between having the right letters lying around and having those letters spontaneously organize themselves into something that can read itself, copy itself, and pass information to the next generation remains one of the largest unsolved problems in the origin of life field, sometimes referred to by researchers simply as the abiogenesis problem. Some scientists suspect this transition might have happened relatively easily, perhaps repeatedly, in warm tidal pools or around the mineral-rich chimneys of deep-sea hydrothermal vents. where chemical gradients and constant energy flow could have nudged simple molecules toward increasing complexity over a few 100 million years. Other scientists suspect the opposite, that this transition represents an almost unimaginably improbable chemical accident, the kind of event that might only happen once in the entire observable history of a galaxy. We simply do not know which of these pictures is closer to the truth, and that uncertainty alone accounts for a significant portion of the range in Drake equation estimates. But even if we grant, generously, that simple life emerges relatively easily under the right planetary conditions, a second and arguably even more difficult obstacle sits directly in its path. And this is where the conversation shifts from the origin of life to the emergence of complexity, and specifically to one of the strangest and most consequential events in the entire history of biology on this planet, an event known as the endosymbiotic origin of the eukaryotic cell. For roughly 2 billion years after life first appeared on Earth, nothing on this planet was more complex than a simple bacterial cell. 2 billion years. To put that span of time in perspective, if you compressed the entire 4.5 billion year history of Earth into a single 24-hour day, life would appear sometime around 4 in the morning, and it would remain nothing more sophisticated than simple single-celled organisms until roughly 4 in the afternoon that same day. For nearly half of Earth's entire existence, the most advanced form of life anywhere on the planet was a bacterium. Then, roughly 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, something happened that current evidence suggests occurred perhaps only once in the entire history of life on Earth. One simple cell, through a process that remains genuinely mysterious in its exact mechanics, engulfed another simple cell. But instead of digesting it, as would normally happen, the two cells settled into an uneasy, permanent partnership. The smaller cell survived inside the larger one, and over time evolved into what we now call the mitochondria, the tiny internal structures that generate energy inside nearly every complex cell on this planet, including every single cell in your own body right now as you lie there listening to this. This event, sometimes called the endosymbiotic event, appears to be the single moment that made complex life possible. Every plant, every animal, every fungus, every complex organism that has ever existed on Earth descends from that one ancient merger between two simple cells. And as far as the fossil and genetic evidence can tell us, it may have happened only that one time in nearly 4 billion years of continuous life existing on this planet. The evolutionary biologist Nick Lane, who has written extensively on this subject, has argued that this event might represent one of the true great filters in the history of life, a bottleneck so narrow and so improbable that it could easily be the primary reason the universe appears so quiet. Simple bacterial life, he argues, might be common throughout the cosmos, might in fact be blooming right now on a significant fraction of those tens of billions of habitable worlds we talked about a moment ago. But complex life, the kind of life with enough internal energy and enough cellular sophistication to eventually build nervous systems and brains and eventually civilizations, might require this same essentially accidental merger to occur. And if that merger is as staggeringly improbable as the current evidence suggests, then the galaxy could be quietly full of simple microbial life. Oceans of bacteria drifting on 1 billion worlds, and almost entirely empty of anything that could ever look up and wonder about the stars. This is the first real glimpse of what scientists call the Great Filter, an idea we will return to and examine in much greater depth later tonight, because it turns out to have a darker twin lurking on the other side of the equation. But for now, Sit with this thought as it stands. It is entirely possible that the hardest step in the entire journey from lifeless chemistry to a civilization capable of building radio telescopes is not intelligence, it is not technology, it is not even life itself in its most basic form. It might be this one strange, ancient, almost accidental merger between two microscopic cells. An event so improbable that it may have only happened once, on one planet, in the entire visible universe. And even if a world clears that hurdle, even if it produces complex, multicellular life capable of evolving nervous systems and eventually brains, there remains one more question waiting on the other side. A question that reaches beyond biology entirely and into pure astronomical chance. Because complex life takes an extraordinarily long time to evolve into intelligence, and during all of that time, a planet has to survive. It has to dodge asteroids. It has to avoid the worst outbursts of its own sun. It has to sit in exactly the right kind of galactic neighborhood, orbiting exactly the right kind of star, protected by exactly the right kind of magnetic shielding, for hundreds of millions of years without a fatal interruption. That question of just how many separate strokes of luck it took for this particular planet to produce something capable of listening to this sentence right now is where we're headed next. Part 4. The Rare Earth Problem. Let's assume, for a moment, generously, that the endosymbiotic bottleneck we just walked through is not actually as narrow as it appears. Let's assume complex life, once it clears that hurdle, is reasonably common across the galaxy, quietly evolving on world after world, wherever the chemistry and the cellular luck line up. Even under that generous assumption, there is a second, entirely separate category of obstacle waiting. One that has nothing to do with biology at all. It has to do with real estate. With the specific, narrow, and surprisingly fragile set of astronomical conditions a planet needs in order to remain stable enough, for long enough, to let evolution do its slow and patient work. This is sometimes called the rare earth hypothesis, first laid out in detail by the paleontologist Peter Ward and the astronomer Donald Brownlee in a book published in 2000. Their argument was not that simple microbial life is rare. In fact, they largely agreed that simple life might be common throughout the universe, arising fairly easily wherever liquid water and basic chemistry are present. Their argument was specifically about complex life, and more specifically still, about the almost absurdly long list of conditions that appear to have been necessary for complex life to not just appear on Earth, but to survive here uninterrupted for the better part of 4 billion years. Let's walk through some of those conditions slowly, because each one, on its own, sounds like a minor detail. Together, they start to feel like something closer to a conspiracy of good fortune. Start with our sun. Stars come in an enormous range of sizes and temperatures, but the vast majority of stars in the galaxy, something on the order of 3 out of every 4, are small, cool, dim stars called red dwarfs. They are appealing targets for the search for life because they are so common, and because their habitable zones, though close in, do exist. But red dwarfs come with a serious complication. Many of them are prone to violent, unpredictable flares, sudden eruptions of radiation that can blast a nearby planet with lethal doses of ultraviolet and X-ray energy, potentially stripping away its atmosphere over time or sterilizing its surface outright. Our sun, by contrast, is a relatively rare type of star. A stable, calm, main-sequence yellow star that burns steadily for billions of years without the kind of violent temperament that characterizes its smaller, more common cousins. That stability was not guaranteed. It was, in a very real sense, a stroke of luck. Now consider the Moon. Earth's moon is unusually large relative to its host planet, far larger, proportionally, than almost any other moon in the solar system relative to the planet it orbits. Current evidence suggests it formed from a catastrophic collision roughly 4.5 billion years ago between the early Earth and a Mars-sized planet sometimes referred to as Theia. That impact was violent almost beyond imagining, but its long-term consequence turned out to be quietly essential to everything that followed. The Moon's gravity stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, keeping it locked at a relatively steady 23.5 degrees. Without that stabilizing influence, computer models suggest Earth's tilt could wobble chaotically over millions of years, swinging from nearly no tilt at all to extreme angles that would produce catastrophic, unpredictable climate swings. The kind of instability that could make it extraordinarily difficult for complex ecosystems to persist long enough to evolve intelligence. Our large moon may not be a decoration in the night sky. It may be one of the quiet, load-bearing pillars of our own existence, and it arrived here by way of a planetary collision so violent it is difficult to picture. Now consider our position within the galaxy itself. Not every region of the Milky Way is equally hospitable. Near the galactic center, star systems are packed closely together, radiation levels run high, and the sheer density of stars, supernovae, and other violent astrophysical events makes long-term planetary stability far less likely. Out at the extreme edges of the galaxy, star systems tend to contain fewer of the heavier elements needed to build rocky planets in the first place, since those heavier elements are forged inside stars and only become widely available after generations of earlier stars have lived, died, and seeded the surrounding gas with their remains. Our solar system sits in what some astronomers call the galactic habitable zone, a comfortable middle distance from the crowded, violent core, in a region enriched with heavier elements by earlier generations of stars, but not so enriched or so crowded that catastrophic nearby events become a constant threat. Then there is Jupiter. For decades, popular science described Jupiter as Earth's cosmic bodyguard, its immense gravity supposedly sweeping up incoming comets and asteroids before they could reach the inner solar system and strike Earth. More recent research has actually complicated this picture somewhat, suggesting Jupiter's gravitational influence is more nuanced, occasionally flinging dangerous objects toward the inner solar system as often as it deflects them away. But what remains broadly true is that the specific architecture of our solar system, the arrangement, sizes, and orbital patterns of its planets, has produced a relatively stable, predictable environment for the inner rocky worlds over billions of years, free of the kind of orbital chaos that computer simulations show can develop in many other planetary system configurations, sometimes ejecting inner planets entirely or sending them spiraling into their star. And then there is plate tectonics, a feature of Earth that, as far as current evidence suggests, may be unusually rare even among rocky planets. Earth's crust is broken into moving plates that grind against each other, sink beneath one another, and continually recycle material between the surface and the deep interior. This process does more than just cause earthquakes and build mountain ranges. It plays a critical role in regulating the planet's long-term climate, drawing excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere over geological timescales and preventing the kind of runaway greenhouse effect that appears to have overtaken Venus, a planet remarkably similar to Earth in size and composition, now sitting beneath a crushing atmosphere and surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead. Plate tectonics may require a very particular combination of internal heat, water content, and planetary size to get started and sustain itself, and we do not yet fully understand why Earth has it while its nearest planetary sibling apparently does not. Layer these factors together. A stable, long-lived, calm star. A precisely sized, stabilizing moon formed by a specific and violent collision. A comfortable position within the galaxy, neither too close to its dangerous core nor too far out in its element-poor edges. A planetary architecture stable enough to avoid the kind of chaotic, gravitational disruption that seems common in other systems. And an active, ongoing geological process regulating the climate across billions of years. None of these factors, individually, seem impossibly rare. Many of them likely occur elsewhere in the galaxy in various combinations. But the rare Earth hypothesis argues that when you require all of them simultaneously on the same planet, maintained continuously for the roughly 4 billion years complex life apparently needs to evolve from simple cells into something capable of building a radio telescope. The number of worlds satisfying every single condition at once may be extraordinarily small. This is precisely the kind of factor the Drake equation gestures toward without ever being able to quantify, and it is worth pausing here to notice something important about the shape of the argument we have built across these last two parts of tonight's story. We are not talking about a single filter, one dramatic singular obstacle standing between lifeless chemistry and a spacefaring civilization. We are talking about a long chain of filters, stacked one after another, each one narrowing the odds a little further. The origin of life itself, the endosymbiotic leap from simple to complex cells, the specific astronomical stability required to protect that complexity for billions of uninterrupted years. Multiply enough narrow odds together, even odds that individually don't sound especially extreme, and you can very quickly arrive at a number small enough to explain, all on its own, why the galaxy might contain only one planet out of all its hundreds of billions that ever got far enough along this chain to start looking up and asking questions. This idea that the profound silence we observe might be explained not by any single catastrophic barrier, but by an entire sequence of narrow, compounding obstacles, is closely related to a concept economist Robin Hanson would later formalize and give a name that has since become central to this entire field of study: the Great Filter. And once you understand how that concept actually works, you run directly into the single most unsettling question in this entire subject. Not whether the filter exists, but whether it sits behind us, already survived, or whether it is still waiting somewhere ahead. That question is where we're going next. Part 5. The Great Filter, and the question you cannot unask. In 1996, the economist and physicist Robin Hanson wrote a short, quietly devastating essay attempting to formalize an idea that had been circling the edges of the Fermi Paradox for decades. He called it the Great Filter, and once you understand the logic behind it, you will find it genuinely difficult to stop thinking about, because it reframes the entire silence of the universe into a single, deeply personal question about our own future. Here is the core of the idea, laid out as simply as I can manage. Somewhere between lifeless chemistry on one end and a galaxy-spanning, star-faring civilization capable of colonizing its neighbors on the other end, there must exist at least one extraordinarily difficult step. A transition so improbable, so narrow, that almost nothing that starts down this road ever makes it all the way through. We know this must be true, logically, because if every step along that road were relatively easy, the galaxy, as we spent the last hour establishing, should already be teeming with visible, detectable civilizations. It is not. Therefore, somewhere along the chain, there is a bottleneck, a filter. Something is stopping almost everything from getting through. The unsettling part, the part that Hanson's essay forces you to sit with, is that we do not actually know where that filter is located, and our own position, relative to it, matters enormously. Consider the first possibility. The filter is somewhere behind us. Perhaps it is the origin of life itself, that mysterious transition from simple chemistry into self-replicating biology that we still cannot recreate in a laboratory. Perhaps it is the endosymbiotic merger of two simple cells that gave rise to complex life, an event the fossil and genetic record suggests may have happened only once in nearly 4 billion years. If the filter sits behind us, in our past, then it means we have already done the impossible. We have already cleared the one obstacle that stops almost everything else in the universe from ever reaching intelligence and technology. Under this version of events, the silence of the sky is not a warning. It is a kind of quiet reassurance. It would mean humanity is exceptionally, perhaps almost uniquely, rare and fortunate, and that our future, however uncertain in its details, is not fundamentally capped by some external, unavoidable catastrophe. We got through the hard part already, simply by existing. Now consider the second possibility, and I want you to notice how differently it sits in your chest. What if the filter is not behind us? What if it is still ahead? Under this version of events, the universe is not filtered by the difficulty of starting life, or the difficulty of evolving complexity, or even the difficulty of evolving intelligence. Under this version, those steps might be relatively common, occurring on world after world across the galaxy. Life might begin easily. Complexity might arise regularly. Intelligence itself might not be especially rare at all. Instead, the filter would be located somewhere just beyond where we currently stand, waiting in our near future. An obstacle so consistently fatal that every single civilization that has ever approached it on every single one of those billions of potentially habitable worlds has failed to pass through it, every one, without exception. This is the version of the Fermi Paradox that keeps some scientists awake at night, and it is worth understanding exactly why it is so much more frightening than it might initially sound. If the great filter lies ahead of us, then the profound silence of the universe is not evidence of our own rarity or good fortune. It is a kind of statistical warning sign, a graveyard we cannot see, filled with the failed civilizations of 100 billion worlds, all of whom presumably felt, at some point in their own history, very much the way we feel right now. Curious, hopeful, reaching toward the stars. And every single one of them, without exception, ran into something that stopped them cold before they could spread far enough to become visible to the next civilization coming up behind them. What could a filter like that possibly look like? This is where the conversation becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because the candidates that scientists have proposed are not exotic alien monsters or mysterious cosmic forces. They are disturbingly close to home. Consider nuclear weapons. Humanity developed the technological and scientific sophistication to build weapons capable of ending civilization within a single century of first learning to fly. Consider engineered pathogens, biological agents deliberately or accidentally released that could spread across a densely interconnected, technologically advanced population faster than any natural disease in history. Consider the possibility, increasingly discussed in serious scientific and philosophical circles, that any sufficiently advanced civilization inevitably develops artificial intelligence capable of recursive self-improvement. intelligence that quickly exceeds its creator's ability to understand or control it, with consequences that are, by definition, difficult for the creating species to predict in advance. Consider runaway climate change, or resource exhaustion, or the simple, grinding possibility that any civilization advanced enough to reshape its own planet inevitably reshapes it into something that can no longer sustain the civilization that built it. The philosopher Nick Bostrom, who has written extensively on existential risk, has argued that from a purely statistical standpoint, discovering that we are entirely alone in the universe, that not even simple microbial life exists anywhere else, would actually be good news, genuinely good news, because it would suggest the great filter sits comfortably behind us. In the extraordinary improbability of life's origin rather than lurking somewhere in our own immediate future. Conversely, Bostrom has pointed out that the discovery of even simple, independently evolved life elsewhere, say primitive bacteria on Mars, or in the subsurface ocean of one of Jupiter's or Saturn's icy moons, would actually be troubling news, not exciting news, because it would suggest that the easy steps, the origin of life, perhaps even the leap to complexity, are common throughout the universe, which would mean the filter, the truly difficult, almost impossibly narrow bottleneck, is more likely to be located further along the chain, closer to us, possibly still ahead. This is precisely why, when missions like Perseverance search for evidence of ancient microbial life on Mars, or when scientists study the strange plume-venting ice moon Enceladus for hints of biological activity in its buried ocean, the stakes of what they might find run in a genuinely unsettling direction. A confirmed discovery of independently evolved life, even something as humble as bacteria, would not simply be a moment of scientific triumph. It would quietly shift the probability of where humanity's own great filter is located, and it would shift it in the direction none of us particularly want to hear. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy at this point in the story to tip over into pure dread, and that is not actually where the evidence leaves us. The honest scientific position is that we simply do not know where the filter sits, or whether it exists as a single dramatic event at all, rather than the long compounding chain of smaller obstacles we spent the last 2 parts of tonight walking through. It is entirely possible that there is no single great filter, no one catastrophic bottleneck, but rather an accumulation of many separate, moderately improbable steps, each one narrowing the odds a little further, the way water slowly narrows a canyon over millions of years rather than one single dramatic collapse. Under that picture, there may be no future catastrophe specifically waiting for us at all. We may have simply already run the gauntlet of low probability events required to get us to this exact point, sitting here, in the dark, thinking about it. But the great filter concept remains one of the most important intellectual tools we have for thinking clearly about the Fermi Paradox, precisely because it forces a question that is normally very easy to avoid. It asks you to consider, honestly, which direction you would rather the silence be pointing. And it asks you to consider that our own choices, right now, in this century, with these specific technologies, might matter rather more than we tend to assume when we go about our ordinary days. For now, let's set that particular unease aside, gently, and turn toward a different category of explanation entirely. Because not every proposed solution to Fermi's question assumes something has gone catastrophically wrong somewhere along the chain. Some of the most interesting proposed answers assume, instead, that everything has gone right, that the galaxy actually is full of intelligent life, and that the silence we observe is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of something else entirely. Deliberate, patient watching, that is where we're going next. Part 6. The zoo, the dark forest, and the reasons they might be hiding. Let's set aside for a moment the idea that the universe is empty. Let's entertain a different and in some ways far stranger possibility. What if the galaxy is not silent because life is rare? What if it is silent because life has learned, collectively and independently, across 100 billion worlds? That silence is the safest thing to be. This category of explanation goes by several names in the scientific and science fiction literature, and the first and oldest of them is called the zoo hypothesis. It was first proposed in a serious, formal way by the radio astronomer John Ball in 1973, and the core idea is deceptively simple. Perhaps advanced civilizations do exist throughout the galaxy in significant numbers, and perhaps they are aware of us. But perhaps they have made a deliberate collective decision not to make contact, not to interfere, not even to reveal themselves, because doing so would fundamentally disrupt whatever it is we are still in the process of becoming. Think about how we, on Earth, already treat certain vulnerable environments. Researchers studying uncontacted tribes in the Amazon rainforest go to extraordinary lengths to avoid direct interaction, not because those communities are unimportant, but precisely because they understand how catastrophically disruptive contact can be. Diseases we have long since developed immunity to can devastate populations with no prior exposure. Cultural and technological shock can unravel social structures that took centuries to develop. The prevailing ethical position among anthropologists today is that the most respectful, most protective thing you can do in many cases is to observe from a careful distance and not interfere at all. Now scale that principle up. If there are civilizations in this galaxy that are millions of years more advanced than we are, civilizations that mastered space travel, energy production, and perhaps even biology and physics on levels we cannot currently imagine, they may have developed an ethical framework refined over eons that treats young. Developing civilizations rather the way we treat an uncontacted tribe. Something to be protected, studied perhaps from a careful and undetectable distance, but never approached directly. Under this hypothesis, Earth is not undiscovered. Earth is under a kind of quiet, deliberate quarantine, a cosmic nature reserve, and the silence we perceive as emptiness is, from the other side, an act of profound restraint. It is an elegant idea, and it has a certain emotional appeal, because it allows for a universe that is full of life without requiring us to explain why none of that life has ever said hello. But it has a serious logical weakness, one that skeptics have pointed out since Ball first proposed it. The zoo hypothesis requires near total unanimity. It requires that every single civilization, across potentially thousands or millions of separate species, spread across 100 billion star systems, with no shared culture, no shared history, and no way of directly coordinating with one another, has independently arrived at and continued to follow the exact same policy of total non-interference without a single exception. For the entire multi-billion-year history during which any of them might have been capable of contacting us. It only takes one curious civilization, one rogue faction, one scientific mission willing to break protocol to end the silence. And in 100 billion star systems, over billions of years, expecting perfect, unanimous restraint starts to feel like a very heavy assumption to carry. Which brings us to a darker, and in some ways more logically self-consistent, version of the same basic idea. It is often called the dark forest hypothesis, a term popularized by the science fiction author Lou Sixin in his novel of the same name. Though the underlying logic draws on older ideas in game theory, and it has been taken seriously enough by working physicists and philosophers that it is worth examining carefully on its own terms. Here is the reasoning, and I want to walk through it slowly, because it builds on itself in a way that becomes genuinely chilling if you let it. Imagine the galaxy is, in fact, quietly full of intelligent civilizations at every conceivable stage of technological development, from primitive to almost incomprehensibly advanced. Every one of those civilizations shares two basic universal constraints. First, resources, whether energy, matter, or habitable territory, are ultimately finite, and any civilization advanced enough to expand will eventually compete for them. Second, and more importantly, it is fundamentally impossible for any civilization to reliably know in advance whether a newly detected civilization is friendly, hostile, or something in between, because a civilization only a few centuries more advanced than another could represent a threat so overwhelming, so instantaneous, and so impossible to defend against, that there would be no opportunity to correct a mistaken first impression. Under those two constraints, the theory argues the only rational survival strategy for any civilization, once it becomes advanced enough to understand its own vulnerability, is to remain as quiet and undetectable as possible, while simultaneously watching carefully for any sign of another civilization revealing itself. And if such a sign is ever detected, the safest possible response from a purely game theoretic standpoint is not to make contact. It is to eliminate the newly revealed civilization before it has any chance of becoming a threat, quickly, quietly, and from as safe a distance as possible. This produces a truly unsettling metaphor, the one that gives the hypothesis its name. Picture the galaxy as a dark, silent forest at night. Every civilization within it is, in effect, a hunter, moving carefully through the trees, armed and fundamentally invisible to every other hunter, precisely because visibility itself is the single greatest danger any of them could expose themselves to. Under this model, the silence of the universe is not emptiness. It is not restraint born of ethics. It is a vast, unspoken, universal survival strategy adopted independently by every intelligent species advanced enough to grasp the stakes involved. Talking is how you die. This hypothesis, if it is even partly accurate, casts humanity's own history of sending signals out into the galaxy in a genuinely uncomfortable new light. In 1974, astronomers used the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico to beam a deliberately encoded message toward the globular star cluster M13, roughly 25,000 light-years away, containing basic information about human biology, our solar system, and our DNA. Various other messages, some official, some private commercial ventures, have been sent since. The physicist Stephen Hawking, among others, publicly and repeatedly warned against this kind of active intentional broadcasting, arguing that until we understand considerably more about what or who might be listening, deliberately announcing our location and our biological vulnerabilities to the entire galaxy might be one of the most reckless things a young civilization could possibly do. I want to be careful, again, not to present the dark forest idea as a confirmed or even a favoured explanation among working scientists, because it is not. It remains a piece of theoretical reasoning, borrowed largely from game theory, applied to a situation, interstellar contact between unknown civilizations, for which we currently have exactly 0 real-world data points. Critics of the hypothesis point out, reasonably, that it assumes hostility and resource competition are the default, universal outcome of encountering another intelligence, an assumption drawn heavily from humanity's own particular evolutionary and historical experience, rather than from any actual evidence about how alien minds, shaped by entirely different evolutionary pressures on entirely different worlds, might actually think. It also assumes that hiding is even possible for a sufficiently advanced civilization, when in fact the very act of existing, of harnessing energy, of building structures, of simply being biologically or technologically active, may leave detectable traces that become progressively harder to conceal the more advanced and energy-hungry a civilization becomes. But whether or not the dark forest hypothesis turns out to describe anything real, it points towards something genuinely important about this entire subject, something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The silence of the universe is not, by itself, evidence of anything in particular. It is simply data, and that data is compatible with almost every explanation we have discussed so far tonight, and several more we have not yet reached. The universe could be silent because life is staggeringly rare. It could be silent because civilizations, even relatively common ones, keep destroying themselves before they can spread. It could be silent because of deliberate, coordinated restraint. Or it could be silent because every advanced civilization out there has independently arrived at the same cold, rational conclusion that in a universe this large and this dangerous, the wisest thing any species can ever do is stay very, very quiet. There is, however, one more category of explanation we have not yet touched, and in some ways it is the most genuinely humbling of them all. Because it does not require civilizations to be rare, or violent, or hiding, or restrained. It only requires them to be uninterested. It suggests that the reason we have never been contacted has less to do with danger, or ethics, or strategy, and more to do with the simple, quietly devastating possibility that a sufficiently advanced intelligence might have very little reason to leave home at all. That is where we're going next. Part 7. The civilization that never leaves home. There is an assumption buried so deeply inside the Fermi Paradox that most people never notice they are making it. The assumption is this: any sufficiently advanced civilization will naturally and inevitably want to expand, that it will want more territory, more resources, more stars, more galaxies. The way empires on Earth have historically wanted more land, more subjects, more gold. This assumption feels so obvious, so deeply embedded in the way we tell stories about the future, that it rarely gets questioned directly. But it is worth questioning carefully, because if it turns out to be wrong, an enormous portion of the Fermi Paradox simply dissolves. Let's start with a strange, quiet fact about human history that gets mentioned surprisingly rarely in these conversations. Humanity has spent the overwhelming majority of its existence as a species, something on the order of 95% of the roughly 300,000 years anatomically modern humans have walked this planet as small, wandering groups of hunter-gatherers. And for the vast, vast majority of that time, our ancestors were not driven by anything resembling a desire for interstellar expansion. They were driven by considerably more immediate concerns: where the next meal was coming from, whether the group beside the river was friendly or hostile, whether the coming winter would be survivable. The idea of colonizing other star systems would have been, quite literally, unimaginable, not because our ancestors lacked intelligence, but because their entire cognitive and cultural apparatus was built around problems that existed on a completely different scale. The drive toward expansion, toward exploration, toward reaching beyond the horizon is not some fixed, universal law of intelligent life. It is a specific cultural and historical pattern that emerged under a specific and, in cosmic terms, extremely recent set of circumstances. Agricultural surplus, competing nation-states, industrial capacity, a particular convergence of economic incentive and technological capability that happened to align here on Earth in roughly the last 5 centuries. There is no obvious reason to assume that pattern is universal, and there is at least one very interesting reason to suspect it might actually become less common, not more common, as a civilization becomes more technologically sophisticated. This is where a concept called the Great Filter's quiet cousin, sometimes referred to informally as the transcension hypothesis, becomes genuinely interesting to sit with. The idea was developed most thoroughly by the futurist John Smart, and it proposes something that runs directly against the entire intuitive framework of the Fermi Paradox. It proposes that as civilizations become more advanced, they do not expand outward toward the stars at all. Instead, they turn inward toward increasingly dense, increasingly miniaturized, increasingly virtual and computational forms of existence, and their appetite for physical expansion across the cosmos actually decreases the more advanced they become. Consider the trajectory of human computing over just the past 70 years. The earliest electronic computers filled entire rooms and could perform only a tiny fraction of the calculations that the device sitting on your nightstand right now can perform in a fraction of a second. Computing power, information storage, and processing efficiency have followed a relentless exponential trend towards smaller, denser, more energy-efficient systems. A trend that shows no fundamental sign of stopping until it approaches the actual physical limits imposed by quantum mechanics and thermodynamics. If this trend continues for even a few more centuries, let alone millennia, the amount of computational complexity, the amount of simulated experience, the sheer richness of an artificial or virtual environment that could theoretically be packed into an extremely small, extremely energy-efficient physical space becomes almost impossible to overstate. Now ask yourself an uncomfortable question, one that sits at the very heart of this hypothesis. If a civilization reaches a point where it can construct virtual, simulated, or deeply augmented realities of essentially unlimited richness and complexity, realities in which any experience, any environment, any form of existence can be generated and explored, indistinguishable in every meaningful sense from physical reality, why would that civilization spend the astronomical amounts of energy, time, and resources required to physically colonize a nearby star system when it could instead direct those same resources inward toward building denser, richer, more sophisticated computational and experiential environments, right where it already is? This idea connects to something we touched on briefly earlier tonight, the concept of a megastructure sometimes called a matryoshka brain, an enormous computational structure built around a star. Designed to capture the entirety of that star's energy output and convert it directly into computation on a scale that dwarfs anything currently conceivable with human technology. A civilization that builds something like this would have, quite plausibly, more raw computational and experiential capacity available to it right there around its home star than it could ever meaningfully gain by mounting the extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily slow, and extraordinarily risky project of sending physical colonists across the crushing distances of interstellar space. Distances that even at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light would still require decades, centuries, or millennia to cross, one star system at a time. Under this hypothesis, advanced civilizations do not vanish, and they do not necessarily hide out of fear the way the dark forest idea proposes. They simply stop expanding outward, because outward expansion stops being the most rational, most rewarding use of their resources. They turn inward instead, becoming smaller, denser, quieter, and increasingly indistinguishable from the outside from ordinary background astrophysical processes. A star with an advanced civilization wrapped tightly and efficiently around it, converting its energy directly into computation, might not look dramatically different. From tens or hundreds of light years away from an ordinary star, there would be no fleet of golden ships, no sprawling, glittering empire spreading visibly across the galaxy. Just quiet stars, burning the same as they always have, hiding an almost unimaginable richness of experience within. There is something genuinely strange and worth sitting with about how this hypothesis inverts the entire emotional register of the Fermi Paradox. Most explanations for cosmic silence carry an undertone of tragedy, extinction, danger, or fear. This one carries something closer to contentment. It suggests that advanced intelligence, once it reaches a certain threshold, might simply stop wanting what we currently assume it would want. It might discover the way individual humans sometimes discover across the course of a single lifetime that the endless pursuit of more territory, more conquest, more physical expansion is simply not where the richest and most rewarding forms of experience are actually found. I want to be honest with you about the weaknesses of this idea too, because every explanation we have covered tonight deserves the same careful scrutiny. Critics point out that this hypothesis requires every advanced civilization, again, universally and without meaningful exception, to arrive at the same philosophical and practical conclusion that inward computational richness is preferable to outward physical expansion. It only takes one civilization out of the potentially enormous number that might exist across 100 billion star systems to retain an appetite for physical colonization for the entire logic of the Fermi Paradox to reassert itself. A single expansionist civilization, given even a modest head start of a few million years, an eye blink on cosmic timescales, would still be expected to have spread visibly across a significant portion of the galaxy by now. And there is a deeper, more uncomfortable question buried inside this whole idea as well, one that connects directly back to something Fermi himself was implicitly asking that day at Los Alamos. If a civilization does turn inward, content within its own constructed richness, is it still, in any meaningful sense, alive in the way we currently understand that word? Or has it simply, quietly, ceased to be the kind of thing capable of reaching outward at all, become something closer to a beautiful, self-contained ending? A species that succeeded so completely at building a perfect internal world that it simply stopped needing the rest of the universe. There is no way, currently, for us to know which of these pictures, if any, is closer to the truth. But notice something about the shape of the story we have built so far tonight, across these first 7 parts. We have moved from staggering numbers, suggesting the galaxy should be loud, through a series of biological filters that might make life and complexity far rarer than those numbers imply, through the possibility of deliberate concealment, born of ethics or fear, and now to the possibility that advanced intelligence might simply lose interest in the very kind of expansion the paradox assumes it would pursue. Each explanation, taken on its own, is plausible. None of them, individually, feels fully satisfying. And that itself tells you something important about the actual scientific status of this question. We have spent this entire hour so far reasoning our way through possibilities, weighing arguments, following logic as far as it will carry us. But reasoning alone has never been how science actually resolves its deepest uncertainties. At some point, you have to look. You have to build instruments and point them at the sky and listen patiently for as long as it takes. And it turns out humanity has been doing exactly that, quietly and persistently, for more than 60 years now. That search, what it has actually found, what it has ruled out, and one deeply strange signal that for a few brief days in 1977 made an entire team of astronomers wonder if the silence had finally broken, is where we're going next. Part 8. 60 Years of Listening. On the evening of August 15th, 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio, nicknamed Big Ear, was quietly doing exactly what it had been built to do. Scanning the sky, patiently, methodically, listening for any radio signal that might carry the fingerprint of something artificial, something that could not be explained by ordinary astrophysics. The telescope operated largely on autopilot, recording data onto reams of paper printouts that a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Emmon would review, line by line, days or sometimes weeks after the observations had actually been made. A few days after that August evening, Emmon was working through one of those printouts when he found something that made him stop completely. The data, printed as a long sequence of numbers and letters representing signal strength across different frequencies, showed a burst of radio energy at a very specific frequency that spiked dramatically above the background noise, held remarkably steady for a full 72 seconds, exactly the length of time the rotation of the Earth would have kept a single point in the sky within the telescope's narrow field of view, and then vanished, never to be detected again, not that night, not in any of the many follow-up observations conducted in the years and decades that followed. The signal was strong. It was narrow, concentrated at almost exactly the frequency of 1420 MHz, a frequency associated with neutral hydrogen, the most common element in the universe, and one that had long been theorized by scientists including Frank Drake himself as a logical, almost universal frequency any advanced civilization might choose for interstellar communication, precisely because any other civilization capable of radio astronomy would already be intimately familiar with it. Ehman was so struck by what he was looking at that he circled the relevant sequence of characters in red pen, and in the margin beside it wrote a single word that would go on to become one of the most famous annotations in the history of astronomy. Wow, the wow signal, as it has been known ever since, remains, to this day, one of the strongest candidate signals ever recorded in the entire history of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And it also remains, frustratingly, completely unexplained. Despite extensive searches of the same region of sky in the years that followed, using the same telescope and numerous others since, the signal has never repeated. No comet, a natural source later proposed and subsequently ruled out through careful analysis of the comet's actual radio emissions, adequately explains its specific characteristics. No known satellite, no terrestrial radio interference, no conventional astrophysical phenomenon has ever been definitively matched to what Big Ear recorded that August night. It sits permanently in a strange scientific limbo too compelling to dismiss outright, too singular and unrepeated to confirm as anything more than an intriguing anomaly. I want to be careful here because the honest scientific position on the WOW signal is one of principled agnosticism, not quiet confirmation. A single, non-repeating event, however tantalizing, cannot be verified through the scientific method's most fundamental requirement that a result be independently reproducible. It is entirely possible that the WOW signal represents some rare, poorly understood natural phenomenon we simply have not identified yet. It is entirely possible it was some form of terrestrial interference from 1977 technology that has since faded from use and cannot be retroactively investigated. And it remains, technically, entirely possible that for 72 seconds on an August evening in Ohio, a radio telescope briefly captured something that came from somewhere else. We will very likely never know for certain, and that particular, permanent uncertainty is precisely what has kept the signal so fixed in the public imagination for nearly 5 decades. The WOW signal, however extraordinary, represents only a single moment within a much longer, much more methodical scientific project, one that has been running in various forms since Frank Drake's original Project Ozma in 1960. That broader project is generally known today under the umbrella term SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and it is worth understanding, honestly, both how much ground it has covered and how much of the sky remains, even now, essentially unexamined. Modern SETI research operates primarily by scanning enormous ranges of radio frequencies and increasingly optical wavelengths as well, searching for signals that show the specific tell-tale signs of artificial origin. A signal that is extremely narrow in its bandwidth, for instance, concentrated at a single precise frequency rather than spread across a broad range, is generally considered a strong indicator of artificial origin because natural astrophysical processes tend to produce broad, messy emissions across many frequencies simultaneously, while a deliberately engineered transmitter can concentrate its energy with an efficiency and precision that nature rarely bothers to replicate. The most ambitious SETI effort currently underway is a program called Breakthrough Listen, launched in 2015 with funding from the Russian-Israeli entrepreneur Yuri Milner, in collaboration with prominent scientists including the late Stephen Hawking. The program uses some of the largest and most sensitive radio telescopes on the planet, including the Green Bank Telescope in West Virginia, the very location where Frank Drake's original search began, and the Parkes Observatory in Australia, to conduct the most comprehensive and sensitive search for artificial signals ever attempted, monitoring 1 million of the nearest stars, the entire plane of the Milky Way, and the 100 nearest galaxies beyond our own, across a vastly wider range of the radio spectrum than any previous project had the capability to examine. And here, in the honest results of that decade-long, extraordinarily well-funded effort, we arrive at one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood facts in this entire field. As of the recording of this very episode, no confirmed, verified, repeatable signal of artificial extraterrestrial origin has ever been detected. Not one. Every anomaly investigated so far, and there have been several genuinely interesting candidate signals flagged over the decades since Eamon's original discovery, has eventually been traced back to terrestrial interference, satellite transmissions, or some previously unrecognized but ultimately natural astrophysical phenomenon. It would be easy, hearing that, to conclude that the search itself has been something close to a failure, 60 years of effort producing essentially nothing. But that conclusion badly misunderstands the actual scale of the challenge involved. And it is worth taking a moment to genuinely sit with just how small a fraction of the possibility space we have actually managed to examine so far. The astronomer Jill Tarter, one of the most influential figures in the modern history of SETI research, has offered a particularly useful way of thinking about this. Imagine the entire search for extraterrestrial signals as the equivalent of searching for something specific hidden somewhere within all of Earth's oceans. Now imagine that every single search conducted so far in the history of SETI, every telescope, every survey, every careful scan of the sky across 6 decades of effort amounts, collectively, to having examined a volume of water roughly equivalent to a single large drinking glass dipped once into that entire global ocean. That is not a criticism of the effort. It is simply an honest description of the staggering size of the search space involved when you consider the full range of possible frequencies, the full range of possible signal types, the sheer number of stars that would need to be monitored continuously, and the fact that any civilization transmitting toward us would need to happen to be doing so during precisely the narrow window when our instruments happen to be listening in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right frequency. We have, quite literally, examined only the tiniest, most infinitesimal fraction of the search space available to us. The absence of a confirmed signal, so far, tells us remarkably little about whether such signals exist. It tells us primarily that we have not yet looked nearly long enough, broadly enough, or carefully enough to have any real statistical confidence in concluding anything at all. This is why the search continues, and why it is, in some genuinely important respects, only just beginning to gather real momentum. Newer instruments, including the Square Kilometre Array, currently under construction across sites in Australia and South Africa, promise search capabilities orders of magnitude beyond anything currently available, capable of monitoring vastly larger portions of the sky across vastly wider ranges of frequency with vastly greater sensitivity than any telescope that has come before it. And alongside the traditional radio search, an entirely newer approach has emerged in recent years, one that does not wait for a civilization to deliberately send us a signal at all, but instead searches for the accidental. Passive fingerprints that any sufficiently advanced technological civilization might leave behind, whether it intends to communicate with us or not. That search for what scientists call techno-signatures, the unintentional evidence of technology itself rather than deliberate messages, represents one of the most promising and rapidly developing frontiers in this entire field. And it is where we're going next. Part 9. The fingerprints a civilization cannot help but leave. There is an important distinction quietly hiding inside everything we have discussed so far tonight, and it is worth bringing it fully into the light before we go any further. Everything SETI has searched for across 60 years of effort has been what scientists call a deliberate signal, a message. Something a civilization would need to choose to send actively in our direction at a moment when we happen to be listening. And that requirement that another civilization would need to want to communicate, and would need to be doing so at precisely the right moment, carries an enormous amount of hidden assumption. It assumes intent. It assumes outreach. It assumes, essentially, that somewhere out there another species is behaving the way early 20th century humans imagined behaving, standing at the edge of the cosmic ocean, cupping their hands and shouting into the dark. But there is another, quieter way a civilization might reveal itself, one that requires no intention at all. It requires only existence. The idea rests on a fairly simple premise. Any sufficiently large, sufficiently advanced civilization will inevitably need enormous amounts of energy to sustain itself, and the physical processes involved in harnessing, using, and radiating away that energy tend to leave detectable traces, whether that civilization wants them detected or not. Scientists call this kind of accidental, passive evidence a techno-signature, as distinct from the deliberate messages SETI has traditionally searched for, and the search for techno-signatures represents one of the fastest growing frontiers in this entire field. The most famous, and in some ways most elegant, example of this kind of thinking is a concept first proposed by the physicist Freeman Dyson in 1960 in a short paper with an almost deceptively simple premise. Dyson began from a basic principle of thermodynamics, one you could derive from first principles sitting quietly in a chair. Any civilization that continues growing its energy consumption, generation after generation, the way human civilization has done consistently for the last several centuries, will eventually run up against the hard limit of how much energy is actually available on its home planet. And the next, entirely logical, step beyond that limit is to begin harvesting the energy of its own star directly, rather than merely the sliver of that energy which happens to strike the surface of its homeworld. Dyson proposed that a sufficiently advanced civilization might eventually construct a vast structure, or far more plausibly, an enormous swarm of individual structures, orbiting satellites, solar collectors, habitats, arranged in a shell or a cloud around its home star, capturing a significant fraction of its total energy output. This concept, now popularly known as a Dyson sphere, or more technically and more plausibly a Dyson swarm, has become one of the most enduring images in the search for advanced alien civilizations, and importantly, it is not merely a piece of speculative fiction. It follows directly from basic, well-understood thermodynamics, and it produces a very specific, very testable astronomical prediction. Here is the key insight, the part that makes this idea genuinely useful to working astronomers rather than just a pleasant thought experiment. The laws of thermodynamics do not allow energy to simply vanish. Any structure capturing a significant fraction of a star's energy output would inevitably need to radiate a significant fraction of that captured energy back out again as waste heat in the form of infrared radiation, which means that a star surrounded by an active Dyson swarm should look, from a great distance, unusually dim in visible light, since much of its normal light output would be blocked or captured by the surrounding structures, while simultaneously appearing unusually bright in infrared wavelengths, glowing with the waste heat generated by the civilization living inside that shell. This specific, unusual combination, dim in visible light, unusually warm in infrared, in a way that cannot be explained by any known natural stellar process, is precisely the kind of signature astronomers have begun actively searching for. Several dedicated infrared survey projects have scanned enormous numbers of stars specifically looking for this pattern, and while a handful of intriguing candidate stars have occasionally surfaced over the years, generating brief flurries of excited speculation, every single one investigated so far has eventually been explained by some ordinary, if sometimes unusual, natural astrophysical process, typically involving unusual configurations of orbiting dust or debris disks that happen to mimic, at a distance, the specific infrared signature a Dyson swarm might produce. One particular star, known formally as KIC 84628552, but more widely known by the nickname Tabby's star, after the astronomer Tabitha Boyajian, who led the team that first identified its strange behavior, briefly became one of the most talked about objects in modern astronomy after data from the Kepler Space Telescope revealed it dimming in an extraordinarily irregular, unpredictable pattern, unlike anything else observed among the hundreds of thousands of stars Kepler had monitored. The dimming was not the neat, regular, periodic pattern you would expect from an orbiting planet passing in front of the star, the signal Kepler was specifically designed to detect. It was chaotic, sometimes dimming by as much as 20%, far beyond what even a very large planet could ever cause. For a brief, genuinely electric period in the scientific community, the possibility of an artificial megastructure was raised seriously in peer-reviewed discussion as one hypothesis among several worth investigating. Subsequent, more detailed observation eventually favoured a natural explanation. An unusually dense and irregular cloud of orbiting dust, though even now some of the finer details of Tabby's star's behaviour remain not entirely, completely settled to everyone's satisfaction. Beyond the search for Dyson structures, technosignature research has expanded to look for several other, subtler forms of accidental evidence. Scientists have proposed searching stellar spectra for unusual concentrations of industrial pollutants, specific chemical compounds such as certain chlorofluorocarbons that essentially never occur through natural planetary processes and would strongly suggest industrial activity on a planet's surface, the same way certain synthetic pollutants in Earth's own atmosphere serve as an unmistakable fingerprint of our own civilization to anyone who might be studying us from a great distance. Researchers have proposed searching for unusual patterns of light pollution on the night sides of distant exoplanets, or looking for the characteristic thermal glow that widespread artificial illumination might produce. Some have even proposed that we should search for the specific chemical byproducts of large-scale nuclear activity or unusual artificial patterns in the timing of pulsar signals, since pulsars are so regular and predictable that any deliberate manipulation of their apparent timing might stand out clearly against their natural behavior. None of these searches so far has produced a confirmed detection, but taken together they represent something genuinely important, a fundamental shift in how this entire field approaches the Fermi Paradox. For most of the 20th century, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence was, in practice, largely a search for deliberate radio messages, an approach that requires another civilization to actively want to be found, using a communication technology we happen to already understand and expect. The search for techno-signatures represents something considerably more patient and in some ways more scientifically honest. It does not require another civilization to want anything at all. It only requires that civilization to exist, to consume energy, to leave behind the same kind of unavoidable physical footprint that any sufficiently large, sufficiently technological presence would inevitably create, whether it intends to or not. And this broader, more thermodynamically grounded approach connects directly back to one of the deepest and most productive reframings of the entire Fermi Paradox. One, developed by the astrophysicist Nikolai Kardashev in 1964, decades before techno-signature research became a serious, well-funded discipline. Kardashev proposed a simple scale for classifying the theoretical energy consumption of advanced civilizations, a way of thinking not about culture or biology or intention, but about the one thing that any civilization, regardless of how alien its psychology or its values might be, would still be fundamentally bound by: the basic laws of thermodynamics and the specific calculable amount of energy available to it, depending on how far it had progressed in harnessing the resources of its home planet, its home star, and eventually its entire home galaxy. That scale and the sobering, genuinely humbling place, it puts human civilization on it right now, tonight, as you lie there listening, is where we're going next. Part 10. The scale that measures how far we still have to go. In 1964, the Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kardashev was thinking carefully about a problem closely related to everything we have discussed so far tonight. If astronomers wanted to have any realistic chance of detecting an advanced alien civilization, what specifically should they be looking for? Not culture, not language, not intention. Something more fundamental, something that would remain true regardless of how strange, how different, how utterly alien another civilization's psychology, biology, or values might turn out to be. Kardashev's answer was elegantly simple. Look for energy. Because any civilization, no matter how it thinks, no matter what it wants, no matter what it looks like, is ultimately bound by the same basic laws of physics that govern the availability and transformation of energy throughout the universe. And the amount of energy a civilization can access and productively use tells you something real, something measurable about how technologically advanced it has become. Kardashev proposed a scale, now known as the Kardashev Scale, dividing hypothetical civilizations into three broad categories based specifically on how much energy they had learned to harness. A Type 1 civilization, in Kardashev's original framework, would be one capable of accessing and productively using the total amount of energy available on its home planet. Not merely the energy currently being consumed by its industry and infrastructure, but the full theoretical energy budget of the entire world, including every erg of sunlight striking its surface, every joule locked within its geothermal and tidal systems, all of it harnessed and directed with total efficiency. A Type 2 civilization would be considerably more advanced still, capable of harnessing the entire energy output of its home star. This is precisely where the Dyson sphere concept we just discussed becomes directly relevant, because a fully realized Dyson swarm capturing the total energy output of an entire sun is essentially the physical mechanism by which a Type 1 civilization would transition into a Type 2 civilization. The scale of energy involved at this stage becomes genuinely difficult to hold in your mind. Our own sun radiates, every single second, roughly the same amount of energy that the entirety of human civilization currently consumes in around 500,000 years. And a Type 3 civilization, the final category in Kardashev's original scheme, would be one capable of harnessing energy on the scale of its entire home galaxy, something on the order of the combined output of hundreds of billions of stars. A civilization at this level would represent a form of technological advancement so far beyond our current frame of reference that it becomes genuinely difficult to describe in concrete terms at all. It would not simply be more advanced than us. It would relate to us the way we might relate to a colony of bacteria, not through malice or superiority, but simply through an almost unbridgeable gulf in scale and capability. Now here is the part of tonight's story I want you to sit with carefully, because it tends to be genuinely humbling in a way statistics rarely manage to be. Where does human civilization currently sit on this scale right now, tonight? We are not yet a Type 1 civilization. Not even close, in the strictest sense of Kardashev's original definition. Various researchers, applying more refined versions of his original formula to modern global energy consumption data, have calculated that human civilization currently sits somewhere around 0.7 or 0, 73 on the scale, meaning we have not yet even fully mastered the total energy resources available on our own home planet, despite everything we have built, every city illuminated, every satellite launched, every particle accelerator constructed to probe the fundamental structure of matter itself. Current projections, extrapolating from the historical growth rate of human energy consumption, suggest we might reach the threshold of a true Type 1 civilization sometime within the next 1 to 3 centuries, assuming that growth continues along anything resembling its current trajectory, and assuming, of course, that nothing catastrophic interrupts it along the way. An assumption that connects uncomfortably back to everything we discussed earlier tonight about the Great Filter. The distance between where we currently stand and a Type 2 civilization is frankly staggering to consider. And the distance between a Type 2 civilization and a genuine, fully realized Type 3 civilization is so vast that it becomes almost meaningless to describe using ordinary language. We are not simply behind. We are, in the most literal and technical sense, still standing at the very beginning of a technological ladder whose upper rungs extend into territory our current civilization can only barely gesture toward. And this is precisely why the Kardashev Scale turns out to be such a genuinely useful tool for thinking clearly about the Fermi Paradox, because it reframes the entire search for advanced alien civilizations in a way that moves beyond simple radio signals entirely. If a truly advanced Type 2 or Type 3 civilization exists somewhere within our galaxy, the search for it should not necessarily look like listening for a deliberate greeting. It should look like searching for energy signatures on an almost unimaginable scale. Stars that behave strangely, galaxies whose light output does not match what stellar physics alone would predict, entire regions of space where the ordinary rules governing how matter and energy interact appear to have been quietly, deliberately rearranged. Some researchers have taken this reasoning even further, proposing systematic astronomical surveys designed specifically to search for the signature of Type 3 civilizations at the galactic scale. In 2015, a team of astronomers led by Roger Griffith at Pennsylvania State University conducted precisely this kind of search, examining infrared data from the WISE Space Telescope. Covering roughly 100,000 galaxies, looking specifically for any galaxy whose overall infrared output appeared unusually elevated in a way that might suggest a significant fraction of its stars had been enclosed within Dyson-like structures, capturing and re-radiating stellar energy as waste heat on a truly civilizational, galaxy-spanning scale. The results of that search, and I want you to notice again how consistently this particular pattern has repeated itself throughout every part of tonight's story, were a resounding, almost eerie silence. Not one of the 100,000 galaxies examined showed the specific infrared signature that a significant energy-harvesting Type 3 civilization would be expected to produce. A small handful of galaxies showed some mild, unusual elevation in their infrared output, but every one of those anomalies was ultimately consistent with known, entirely natural astrophysical processes, typically involving unusually active regions of ongoing star formation, rather than anything suggesting deliberate, artificial energy capture on a civilizational scale. This result matters considerably more than it might initially appear to on the surface because of the specific scale at which it operates. This was not a search of our own galaxy, our own tiny corner of the universe, where the failure to find something might simply reflect how small and statistically insignificant a single galaxy's worth of stars actually is. This was a search across 100,000 entire galaxies, encompassing collectively something on the order of many trillions of individual stars. And across that entire staggering sample, not one single unambiguous signature of large-scale, deliberate energy harvesting was detected. What does this actually tell us? It does not prove that advanced Type 3 civilizations do not exist anywhere in the observable universe. A truly advanced civilization might, after all, choose deliberately not to expand in the specific way that would produce this kind of detectable infrared signature. An idea that connects directly back to the inward turning, computationally focused civilizations we discussed a couple of parts ago. But taken at face value, this result places a meaningful, genuinely significant statistical constraint on how common galaxy-spanning, energy-maximizing civilizations actually are. If they exist at all, in any significant number, they are, at minimum, remarkably good at avoiding the specific kind of detectable footprint this particular search was designed to find. Layer this finding on top of everything else we have covered across tonight's story so far, and a pattern starts to emerge. One that is worth sitting with honestly before we move into the final parts of tonight's journey. Every single search conducted so far, whether listening for deliberate radio signals, watching for the specific infrared signature of Dyson structures around individual stars, or scanning entire galaxies for civilizational scale energy harvesting, has returned essentially the same result. Silence, not proof of absence, because as we discussed earlier, the search space involved remains staggeringly, almost incomprehensibly incomplete, but a consistent, repeated, and genuinely meaningful absence of the specific evidence we would expect to find if the galaxy or the universe beyond it were as densely populated with advanced, expansive, energy-hungry civilizations as the raw numbers we opened tonight's story with might naively suggest. This brings us, finally, to the quiet, uncomfortable place where most careful, honest thinking about the Fermi Paradox eventually arrives. Not a confirmed answer, not a triumphant resolution, but a genuinely difficult choice between two possibilities that sit at opposite ends of an enormous emotional and philosophical spectrum. And it is worth walking through both of those possibilities carefully and completely before we allow ourselves to settle into tonight's closing thoughts. That is where we're going next. Part 11, The Two Doors, and what waits behind each one. We have spent the better part of 2 hours now walking slowly through one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in all of science. And at this point in the story, it is worth pausing, gathering everything we have gathered so far, and laying it out clearly, side by side, because the honest scientific position on the Fermi Paradox ultimately narrows down to two broad possibilities, two doors, and we do not yet know which one we are standing in front of. Let's open the first door slowly and sit inside it for a while. Behind this door, we are, in some meaningful and possibly permanent sense, alone. Not necessarily the only life that has ever existed anywhere in the universe, because simple microbial life may well be common, quietly blooming in the subsurface oceans of icy moons, or in warm tidal pools on a billion distant worlds we will never visit, but alone in the specific narrower sense that matters most for tonight's story. The only technological civilization, the only species anywhere within this galaxy, and quite possibly within the much larger reachable universe beyond it, that has ever managed to look up at the night sky and wonder, seriously, scientifically, what it was looking at. If this is the true shape of reality, then everything we walked through together in the earlier parts of tonight's story, the improbability of life's origin, the staggering rarity of the endosymbiotic leap from simple to complex cells, the long, fragile chain of astronomical good fortune required to keep a planet stable for 4 billion uninterrupted years, would represent collectively the great filter sitting comfortably and permanently behind us. Already survived, already cleared. Under this picture, the silence of the universe is not a warning. It is closer to a strange, humbling kind of reassurance, though it carries its own entirely separate weight, one we will need to sit with carefully as tonight's story draws toward its close. Now, let's open the second door. Behind this one, life itself is common, genuinely, meaningfully common, blooming across the galaxy the way the raw statistics we opened tonight's episode with would naturally suggest it should. Simple life, complex life, and quite possibly intelligence itself may have arisen independently on thousands or even millions of worlds across the long history of the Milky Way. But something, some obstacle we have not yet clearly identified, some combination of self-destruction, resource exhaustion, engineered catastrophe, or a filter we do not yet even know how to properly describe, has consistently, reliably, and without a single confirmed exception across the entire multi-billion-year history of this galaxy, prevented any of those civilizations from surviving long enough or expanding far enough to become detectable to any of the others. This is the door that carries the weight of the great filter sitting somewhere ahead of us rather than safely behind. And I want to be honest with you about why this particular possibility unsettles careful thinkers in this field more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. It is not simply the abstract fear of some future catastrophe. It is the statistical implication buried inside it. If this door is the true one, then every civilization that has ever approached this same threshold, across potentially millions of separate worlds, spread across billions of years of galactic history, has failed to pass through it. Without exception. Every single one. Which would mean that whatever obstacle sits ahead of us is not merely difficult. It is, statistically speaking, very close to insurmountable. Neither door, I want to be clear, is confirmed. Neither door is even meaningfully favoured by the current evidence in any statistically rigorous sense. What we actually have, honestly, is 60 years of careful listening that has detected nothing definitive. A growing body of astronomical evidence suggesting that neither Dyson spheres nor galaxy-spanning Type 3 civilizations appear common enough to be easily detected using our current instruments, and an enormous, complicated web of biological and astronomical uncertainty surrounding every single step required to get from lifeless chemistry to a species capable of building a radio telescope in the first place. There is, however, a third way of thinking about this entire problem, one that has gained considerable traction among researchers in recent years, and it is worth walking through carefully before we close tonight's story, because it reframes the entire conversation in a way that feels, to many working in this field, considerably more scientifically honest than either of the two doors we just described. In 2018, a team of researchers at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, led by Anders Sandberg, Eric Drexler, and Toby Ord, published a paper that approached the Drake equation from an entirely different mathematical angle than anyone had previously attempted. For decades, researchers working with the Drake equation had followed a fairly standard, if somewhat naive, approach: take your best single estimate for each term in the equation, the fraction of planets where life emerges, the fraction of life that becomes intelligent, and so on. Multiply those single point estimates together, and arrive at a single final number representing the expected count of civilizations in the galaxy. The Oxford team pointed out a significant, subtle statistical error buried inside that standard approach. Many of the individual terms in the Drake equation are not simply uncertain in the ordinary sense, where the true value probably sits somewhere reasonably close to our best guess. They are uncertain across many orders of magnitude, meaning our honest scientific uncertainty about, say, the probability that complex life evolves from simple life does not span a modest range like 40 to 60%. It spans a range that might run anywhere from odds of 1 in 10 to odds of 1 in 10 million, or smaller still. When individual terms carry that kind of extreme multiplicative uncertainty, simply picking a single best guess for each one and multiplying them together dramatically, systematically understates just how uncertain the final result actually is. When the Oxford team redid the calculation properly, treating each term as a wide, honest probability distribution rather than a single confident guess, and then combining those distributions using proper statistical methods, the results were genuinely striking. A meaningful portion of the resulting probability distribution, once all the uncertainty was properly accounted for, actually clustered around the possibility that humanity is, in fact, entirely alone within the observable galaxy, not as one civilization among many that simply haven't been detected yet, but as the only one that has ever existed. Their analysis suggested that given the full, honest range of scientific uncertainty currently surrounding each term in the Drake equation, it would not actually be statistically surprising in the way it might intuitively feel to find ourselves entirely alone. The raw numbers we opened tonight's story with, the hundreds of billions of stars, the tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds, remain completely accurate. But the compounding uncertainty in every single step required to turn a habitable world into a civilization capable of being detected is large enough, honestly accounted for, that a lonely galaxy is not actually the surprising outcome it initially appears to be. It may, in fact, be the statistically expected one. I find this particular piece of research genuinely important to sit with, here near the close of tonight's story, not because it resolves the Fermi Paradox, but because of what it quietly reveals about the entire shape of the question we have spent the last 2 hours exploring together. The silence of the universe may not require some dramatic, singular explanation at all. No ancient, watchful civilization enforcing a careful policy of restraint. No hidden, universal danger lurking just beyond our current technological horizon. No vast, coordinated silence born of interstellar fear. It may simply be the ordinary, unremarkable statistical consequence of stacking enough narrow, uncertain probabilities on top of one another, each one individually plausible, each one collectively adding up to a universe where the extraordinary, improbable chain of events required to produce something like you, lying there right now, capable of wondering about all of this, might genuinely be rare enough that its nearest equivalent could sit thousands or millions of light years away. Or nowhere at all. We do not know which door we are standing in front of. We may not know for a very long time, possibly not within the lifetime of anyone currently alive, and possibly, depending on which door turns out to be the true one, not ever. But there is something worth carrying with you into tonight's closing thoughts. Something that sits quietly underneath every part of the story we have walked through together this evening, and it has less to do with aliens, and considerably more to do with what all of this uncertainty actually means for the small, warm, improbable planet you happen to be lying on right now. That is where we're going for the final time tonight. Part 12. The Flame in the Dark. Let's come back for a moment to the beginning of tonight's story, to Enrico Fermi walking to lunch at Los Alamos, asking a simple question that nobody at the table could answer. Where is everybody? We have spent nearly 2 hours now walking through nearly every serious attempt anyone has ever made to answer him, and I want to be honest with you, one final time, about where that leaves us. It leaves us without a confirmed answer. It leaves us with a beautifully organized structure of ignorance, each part of tonight's story mapping out exactly where the uncertainty lives, without ever quite managing to fill it in. But I don't think that absence of an answer is actually the most important thing to carry with you as you drift off tonight. I think the most important thing is something quieter, something that sits underneath the entire question, and it has to do with what this silence actually asks of us, regardless of which explanation eventually turns out to be correct. Consider, one more time, the sheer scale of everything we have discussed tonight. Hundreds of billions of stars in this galaxy alone, tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds, scattered across that galaxy like something almost too generous to be believed. 13 billion years of cosmic history stretching out behind us, patient and enormous, long enough for 1,000 separate civilizations to have risen and reached for the stars and fallen silent again, each one leaving behind nothing but an empty, echoing quiet that light itself has not yet had time to carry across the distances involved. And into all of that vastness, as far as every instrument we have ever built has been able to determine, there is, right now tonight, exactly one place where any of it seems to matter. One small, blue, unremarkable planet orbiting an unremarkable star in an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy, where 4 billion years of staggeringly improbable events, the accidental origin of self-replicating chemistry, the almost impossibly rare merger of 2 simple cells into something capable of complexity, the long, fragile, uninterrupted stability of a world protected by a stabilizing moon and a calm, steady sun, somehow against every reasonable statistical expectation, produced something capable of building a telescope and pointing it outward and asking what any of it means. Whether that fact makes humanity profoundly rare, the improbable, singular flame the great filter allowed through, or whether it simply means we are early, one voice among a chorus of civilizations still too far apart, or too quiet, or too young to have found each other yet. The practical weight of that fact settles on us the same way either time. If there is even a real possibility that this small planet represents something close to unique, something close to the only place in this entire galaxy, possibly in the entire observable universe, where matter has arranged itself into something capable of understanding itself, of loving, of wondering, of listening to a voice in the dark and feeling less alone because of it, then what we do with that fact, here, now, in this century, carries a weight that is difficult to fully hold in your mind before sleep, and worth sitting with gently rather than urgently. We talked earlier tonight about the Great Filter and about the deeply uncomfortable possibility that it might still lie somewhere ahead of us rather than safely behind. I don't want to leave you with that thought as something to fear. I want to leave you with it as something closer to an invitation, the same invitation every generation of humans before us has quietly inherited without ever fully realizing it. The choices made in the coming decades about the technologies we build, about how carefully we handle the immense power we have already gathered, about whether we choose to be the kind of civilization that clears its filters rather than the kind that gets stopped by them, are not separate from tonight's cosmic story. They are the story. They are, quite possibly, the only chapter of it that has ever mattered on any of those tens of billions of worlds we spent tonight imagining. There is a particular kind of quiet comfort, I think, in sitting with genuine uncertainty rather than false certainty, and the Fermi Paradox, more than almost any other open question in modern science, forces you into exactly that position. We do not know if we are alone. We do not know if the silence is safety or warning. We do not know if somewhere, right now, on some world circling some star whose light left it before the dinosaurs existed, something else is lying somewhere comfortable, looking up at its own unfamiliar sky, wondering the exact same thing about us. But here is what is true, regardless of which of those possibilities eventually turns out to be correct. Tonight, on this planet, something is awake and thinking and reaching for meaning in the dark, the way it has been doing, quietly, patiently, for as long as there have been humans capable of looking up. That fact alone, whether it turns out to be common throughout the universe or achingly, singularly rare, is not diminished by the silence surrounding it. If anything, the silence makes it larger. It makes this small, warm, improbable act of noticing, of wondering, of listening to a voice telling you a story about the stars while you drift towards sleep, feel like something worth protecting, whether you are the only such flame in the entire universe, or simply one among countless others still waiting, patiently, somewhere out there in the dark, to finally find each other. The universe is enormous. It is old beyond anything your mind can properly hold on to. And it is, as far as we can currently tell, achingly, patiently quiet. But you are here, right now, at the very end of an unbroken 4 billion year chain of improbable events stretching back to the first flicker of chemistry on a young and violent world, and for tonight at least. That quiet does not have to feel empty. It can simply feel like rest, the kind of rest that comes after a long day spent looking outward, before you close your eyes, and let the silence, for now, simply be silence. So let the silence settle now, the way it has settled over this planet every night for 4 billion years, long before there was anyone here to notice it. Somewhere out there, the same stars are still burning, patient and indifferent and beautiful, keeping whatever secrets they keep. And somewhere in you, quietly, the question will still be there tomorrow, waiting the way it always does. For the next quiet hour, when you have nothing to do but wonder. If tonight gave you something to sit with, something to carry gently into sleep, consider staying a while longer in this quiet corner of the internet. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it. Leave a comment and tell me where you drifted off from tonight. I read every one, and it always amazes me how far this small signal travels. And if someone you know needs a reason to feel a little less alone under the same sky, send this their way. Sleep well. The universe will still be here in the morning.